The settlement on Kepler 442b existed at the edge of what the xenobiologists called the habitable margin. During the planet's rotation, temperatures in the northern valleys dropped from -18 degrees Celsius at local sunset to -73 degrees by the deepest hour of the night cycle, which lasted 41 standard hours. The Vrel, a silicon-based species that had established mining operations 3 kilometers south of the human research outpost, maintained their environmental pods at a constant 7 degrees Celsius using quantum thermal regulators that drew power from geothermal taps 200 meters below the surface. Marcus Holt was 67 years old and had spent 32 years in Antarctic field stations before joining the Colonial Survey Program. His wife had died during the transit from Earth, and he had requested assignment to the most remote posting available. He lived in a prefabricated shelter that lost heat through its polymer composite walls at a rate the station engineers had calculated as acceptable but not comfortable. His bunk, like all others in the human section, was equipped with a standard thermal blanket rated to maintain body temperature in environments down to -40 degrees Celsius, provided the ambient shelter temperature remained above freezing. The Vrel engineers visited the human outpost during the 3rd month of the long winter season to inspect the shared atmospheric processes. They observed Marcus mixing clay from the riverbed with dried moss and shaping it into flat blocks, which he laid in a rectangular frame beneath his sleeping platform. The senior Vrel, whose name the translation system rendered as Kareth, paused at the doorway of Marcus's quarters for 4.3 minutes. The observation was logged in the station records. Kareth later filed a report describing the human's activity as thermally inefficient substrate manipulation, with no calculated benefit to core temperature maintenance. Marcus had dug the clay himself from a deposit 700 meters east of the settlement, where the permafrost layer was thin enough to reach workable material. He had learned about thermal mass as a boy in rural Oregon, where his grandfather built a home with a clay stove that held heat through the night after the fire died. The principle was simple. Clay absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly. On Kepler 442b, the day cycle brought enough solar radiation to warm the clay blocks to approximately 22 degrees Celsius if they were positioned near the shelter's southern exposure. At night, while the shelter's interior temperature dropped toward freezing, the clay released that stored warmth over the course of hours. The Vrel used ceramic heating elements embedded in their sleeping platforms, which drew a constant 60 watts per unit from the settlement's power grid. The human thermal blankets were passive systems, but required the shelter's central heating to maintain minimum safe temperatures. Marcus's clay bed required no power at all once the blocks were in place. On day 97 of the winter cycle, a micrometeorite impact damaged one of the 3 geothermal transmission lines that supplied the settlement. The impact occurred at 0300 hours local time, during the coldest phase of the rotation. The station's backup fusion cell automatically compensated, but the power management system initiated conservation protocols that reduced heating in non-critical areas by 40%. The human quarters, classified as residential rather than essential, dropped from their normal 8 degrees to -4 degrees Celsius within 2 hours. The Vrel quarters maintained their 7-degree baseline because life support systems for non-human species held priority in the emergency allocation matrix. However, the reduced power flow to the Vrel heating elements meant each unit now drew 42 watts instead of 60. Kareth's platform temperature dropped to 3 degrees by 0500 hours. The Vrel physiology, adapted to stable underground environments on their home world, began to experience metabolic stress below 4 degrees. Kareth filed a priority request for additional thermal support at 0532 hours. Marcus woke at 0400 hours when the shelter's temperature alarm activated. He pulled his thermal blanket tighter and placed his hand against the clay block nearest to his bunk. The surface temperature was 16 degrees Celsius. The space between his sleeping platform and the clay bed measured 11 degrees, while the ambient air 2 meters away had already fallen to -2 degrees. He remained in his bunk and went back to sleep. By 0700 hours, the Vrel engineers had rerouted power from secondary science equipment to boost the heating elements in their quarters. This temporarily raised platform temperatures to 5 degrees, but the emergency protocols flagged the reallocation as inefficient. The station commander, a human named Chen, authorized distribution of supplemental thermal gear to all personnel. The Vrel received insulated wraps designed for their body structure. The human staff received additional blankets. Marcus declined the extra blanket. When Chen asked for confirmation, Marcus showed him the temperature reading from the sensor he had placed in his sleeping space. It read 14 degrees Celsius at a point 30 centimeters above his mattress. Chen examined the clay blocks and asked how long they would continue radiating heat. Marcus estimated another 6 to 8 hours at useful levels, depending on how much the ambient temperature dropped. The repairs to the geothermal line took 19 hours. During that period, the human residential section reached a minimum of -8 degrees Celsius. 3 staff members reported to the medical bay with symptoms of mild hypothermia. All 3 had been sleeping in standard bunks with standard blankets. The Vrel quarters, despite the power reallocation, could not be maintained above 4 degrees. Kareth and 2 other Vrel spent the day cycle in the medical facility, which held priority heating status. Marcus's sleeping space did not fall below 9 degrees Celsius at any point during the crisis. The clay blocks, which had absorbed solar radiation through the shelter's thermal window during the previous day cycle, continued to release stored energy throughout the coldest hours. When the geothermal line was restored and normal heating resumed, Marcus allowed the clay to cool, then repositioned the blocks near the window to begin absorbing heat again. The station's environmental engineer, a woman named Torres, ran calculations after reviewing the temperature logs. She determined that the clay bed had maintained an average differential of 23 degrees above the ambient air temperature during the power reduction event. Marcus's core body temperature, measured during a routine medical check, had remained at 37.1 degrees throughout the night. His actual sleeping environment had been approximately 61 degrees warmer than the Vrel quarters at the crisis point. Torres submitted a proposal to install similar thermal mass systems in other residential areas. The proposal noted that clay beds required no power, no maintenance, and no rare materials. They functioned through passive solar gain and thermal inertia, concepts that had been well understood on Earth for thousands of years. The proposal was approved and added to the next construction schedule. Kareth visited Marcus's quarters again 4 days after the repairs were completed. The Vrel stood at the doorway for 2 minutes and 40 seconds, observing the clay blocks arranged beneath the sleeping platform. Kareth's translation device rendered a single statement into English. Substrate thermal retention is functional. The Vrel engineer then returned to the southern section and filed a request for clay samples from the eastern riverbed. Marcus continued his work at the research station, collecting atmospheric data and maintaining the monitoring equipment. He slept on the clay bed through the remaining 73 days of winter, and when the spring cycle began and temperatures rose, he left the blocks in place. They absorbed excess heat during the warmer periods and helped stabilize the temperature variations that made sleep difficult for some of the other staff. He did not discuss the design with others unless they asked directly. When they did, he explained the principles in simple terms: mass, absorption, radiation, time. The clay held heat the way stone held heat, the way Earth held heat. It was a patient system, one that worked with the planet's cycles rather than against them. The Vrel eventually installed similar systems in their newer structures, though they used engineered ceramic blocks instead of raw clay. The principle remained the same. Marcus lived on Kepler 442b for 6 more years before requesting transfer to another remote site. His quarters were reassigned to a younger researcher who kept the clay bed and added a second layer of blocks for additional capacity. The system became standard in the northern settlements, noted in the colonial engineering manual as a proven method for passive thermal regulation in low-power environments. The entry included temperature data from the 97th day of that first winter cycle, when the geothermal line had failed and the simple mass of sun-warmed clay had kept one man sleeping soundly, while the most advanced heating systems on the planet struggled to maintain function.